ruthless billionaire, Gabriel Hayes, believed money could replace love, until a shocking letter revealed he had triplets he'd abandoned before they were even born. As he stepped into their lives, every moment shattered his pride and rebuilt his heart. From hospital emergencies to late-night blanket forts, Gabriel discovered that true success wasn't in boardrooms but in bedtime stories and tiny hands that finally called him Daddy. Will his children forgive the years he lost? Where are you watching from? Share below and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of redemption and hope. Gabriel Hayes stood in the corner office of his Manhattan penthouse, staring out over the city that glistened beneath the late spring sun. From this height, the streets looked like delicate etchings on glass, the people no more than dots moving in predictable patterns. It was the view of a man who believed he'd conquered everything worth conquering. At 44, Gabe had built one of the largest technology conglomerates in the world, turned a handful of software patents into a multi-billion-dollar empire, and outlasted every competitor who'd ever tried to take him down. His face appeared on magazine covers. His words moved markets. His name was synonymous with power. And yet, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and golden light slid across the mahogany floor, a hollow ache pressed at the center of his chest. As though all that success had been erected on a foundation of absence he'd never dared to look at too closely. He ran a hand over his jaw, freshly shaved, and tried to shake the feeling off. Today was supposed to be a victory. Investors were gathering tonight to celebrate the launch of the company's new AI platform, and the numbers were already climbing. But the moment his assistant Monica appeared in the doorway, holding a cream-colored envelope between two careful fingers, he knew this day would not go as planned. "Gabriel," she said softly, her dark eyes sympathetic in a way that made his skin prickle. "This arrived by courier an hour ago. It's from Mercer and Associates." Her voice carried a caution he couldn't ignore. Mercer and Associates. He knew the name. How could he not? Olivia's firm. The memory struck him so hard he forgot to breathe. Olivia Mercer. The woman he had once imagined spending every day of his life beside. The woman whose absence still felt like a locked room inside his heart. He took the envelope without speaking, his fingertips numb. Monica hesitated, as if debating whether to say something more, but then she only inclined her head and retreated, closing the glass door behind her with a muted click. For a long moment, Gabe simply stared at his own reflection in the window, the envelope held loosely in one hand. The sight of himself, tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks, flawless haircut, felt absurd, as though he were playing dress-up in someone else's life. With an effort, he set the letter down on his desk, smoothing it flat. He didn't have to open it. His mind had already filled in the possibilities. Legal action. Some formal notice, or worse, some last piece of unfinished business from a marriage he'd spent 6 years trying to bury beneath contracts and acquisitions. His phone buzzed against the desk, snapping him back. Monica's name lit the screen. "The car is ready, sir," she said when he answered. "You have 20 minutes before you're due at the Waldorf. Shall I reschedule?" "No," he heard himself say. "No, I'll be there." He disconnected before she could reply and reached for his jacket. The envelope remained on the desk, as heavy as if it were made of lead. He almost stuffed it into his briefcase. Almost. But in the end, he left it behind. There would be time to dissect it later, he told himself. Time to reckon with the past when tonight's obligations were done. But even as he stepped into the private elevator and watched the numbers count down, he knew he was lying to himself. The past had already arrived, and no amount of pretending would send it away again. The Waldorf ballroom was draped in soft white light, 1,000 glittering candles arranged along the tables, and the air buzzed with the kind of polite electric energy that only money could generate. Gabe moved through the crowd like a man wading through fog, his smile practiced, his handshake firm. He answered questions about growth forecasts and international licensing deals without hearing his own voice. Every time a lull came, every time his mind threatened to drift back to that envelope, he forced himself to focus on the noise around him. It was easier to keep the ache buried beneath the white noise of commerce than to consider what Olivia might want after all this time. "Gabe," called Leonard Price, one of his oldest board members, waving him over to the head table. We saved you a seat. You're late. Traffic, Gabe lied as he sat. He loosened his tie, ignoring the curious glances from the men and women arrayed around him. They all looked so at ease in their designer suits, their perfect lives, the certainty that nothing could ever break through the walls they'd built. He envied them, even as he despised them. A waiter poured sparkling water into his glass, and Gabe was lifting it to his lips when something shifted in the corner of his vision. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But when he turned, the air seemed to vanish from his lungs. 3 tables away, Olivia sat in a navy dress that clung to her in a way that made him remember the nights they'd stayed awake, talking until dawn, the mornings she'd curled against his side, warm and trusting. Her hair was shorter now, cut just below her jaw. She looked older, more serious, but no less beautiful. For a moment, that was all he could see. Then, as she leaned forward to cut someone's food, he saw the children, 3 of them. 2 girls and a boy, all about 6, all with dark hair and bright eyes. They were laughing, the kind of unself-conscious giggle that belonged to people who had never been hurt. His vision tunneled. The boy lifted his face and Gabe felt the floor tilt beneath him. Those eyes, gray-blue, sharp as glass. His own eyes, staring back at him from a face he'd never seen. "Gabriel?" Leonard's voice came, sharp with confusion. "Are you all right?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't even breathe. His mind was racing, calculating in a way it never had in a boardroom. 6 years. The divorce had been finalized just over 6 years ago. He remembered the night Olivia walked out, the way she'd stood by the door, her shoulders trembling as she tried to make him understand he was losing everything that mattered. He'd told himself it was temporary, that he would fix it once he had more time. But time had turned into years. And now, here she was, with children who looked like him, laughing as though he'd never existed. Without thinking, he rose from the table. His chair scraped across the marble floor, drawing glances, but he didn't care. He crossed the room in a few long strides, stopping just behind her. His heart was a drum in his throat. "Olivia," he said, his voice rough. She turned slowly, her eyes widening when she saw him. For an instant, neither of them spoke. Then she set her napkin down and met his gaze levelly. "Gabe," she said softly, her voice calm but wary. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Are they?" He couldn't finish. His throat closed around the question. Olivia looked past him at the children, then back at him. "They're mine," she said, each word deliberate. "Mommy, who's that?" one of the girls asked, glancing curiously between them. "Just someone I used to know," Olivia murmured, but her eyes never left his. He saw it then, the truth she wasn't saying, the flicker of regret in the tight line of her mouth. He swallowed, forcing his voice to steady. "We need to talk." "No," she replied, her tone soft but resolute. "Not tonight. You've made your choices, Gabe. So have I." She turned back to the children, helping the boy cut his food, as if he weren't standing there with his entire world collapsing around him. He wanted to argue, to demand explanations, but the sight of the little boy watching him with open curiosity stole the fight from his lungs. He had never believed in fate. He'd always believed he could engineer any outcome, control every variable. But this was something no strategy could undo. He looked once more at Olivia, at the children who might be his, and knew with bone-deep certainty that no amount of power or wealth could ever matter if he walked away again. His hands were trembling as he returned to his table. Leonard stared at him, confused. Gabe picked up his glass, but the water tasted like nothing. He had never been more aware of everything he had lost. And for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he had to do. Back in his penthouse, Gabriel Hayes stood alone in his study, the envelope from Mercer and Associates resting in the center of his desk like a silent accusation. The city lights blinked beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to the turmoil coiling in his chest. He hadn't bothered to turn on the lamps. Darkness felt more honest somehow, like he didn't have to pretend he was still the man who had walked into that ballroom hours ago. The man who believed the past was neatly sealed away in a box he would never have to open. But the box had been pried open, and now he could see everything he'd been too proud, too blind to face. He reached for the envelope with unsteady fingers, his pulse loud in his ears. The creamy paper was thick and expensive. Olivia had always cared about the details, and he had the ridiculous thought that she'd probably chosen it herself. It smelled faintly of lavender. The scent made his throat tighten. He slipped his thumb beneath the flap, tearing it cleanly, and unfolded the letter inside. The heading was formal: Mercer and Associates, Family Law. His eyes skated past the letterhead to the first lines of Olivia's handwriting. She hadn't signed this off to a paralegal. She'd written it herself, as if she'd wanted him to hear her voice in every word. Gabe, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Part of me doubts you'll even open it. But I have to try. One last time. There are things you deserve to know, things I tried to tell you before, things you wouldn't let yourself hear. The triplets are 6 years old now. Mon Groff, their names are Ava, Isla, and Noah. They are bright and funny and stubborn in ways that remind me of you every single day. You should have been there to see them learn to walk, to hear their first words, to help them on their first day of school. I tried to contact you when I found out I was pregnant. I left messages with your assistant. I sent letters. Eventually, it became clear you had no intention of returning my calls. I won't pretend I understand why. Maybe you were too angry. Maybe it was easier for you not to know. But you know now. Whatever you choose to do with this information, please know I'm not asking for anything from you. Not money. Not support. Not even acknowledgement. But I will not lie to them about who their father is when the time comes. They deserve to know the truth, whether or not you want to be part of it. Take care of yourself, Olivia. He read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. He tried to remember what he'd been doing 6 years ago, when she must have been leaving those messages. Buried in a merger with a European robotics firm, if memory served. Locked in meetings that had lasted past midnight. Convinced that if he could just keep building the empire, the emptiness she'd left would somehow be filled. But it never had been. All he'd done was cement the distance between them until there was no way back. His hands were trembling when he set the letter down. He sank into the chair behind his desk, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. He stayed like that for a long time, the city lights winking through his fingers. When the clock on the wall struck 2, he finally stood and crossed to the sideboard where he kept a decanter of whiskey. He poured himself a glass, though he rarely drank, and took a long swallow. The burn was almost comforting. Almost. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old contacts until he reached Monica's name. She picked up on the second ring, her voice hushed with sleep. Gabe, is everything all right? I need you to come in early tomorrow, he said, ignoring how hoarse he sounded. There are things we need to discuss. A pause. Of course, I'll be there. He ended the call and stood for a moment, the phone heavy in his hand. He thought of Olivia's face when she'd looked up at him in the restaurant. Cautious, resigned. How many times had she tried to tell him before she'd given up? He'd told himself that shutting her out was an act of self-preservation, that if he could just keep her out of sight, she would fade from his mind, and he could move on. But she hadn't faded, not even close. When dawn broke over the skyline, he was still awake, still turning the letter over and over in his hands like it might give him some answer he hadn't already found. The answer was simple. He'd failed her, failed them all, and no empire he built could ever change that. By the time Monica arrived, he had showered and dressed, though the pallor in his reflection told its own story. She set her purse down carefully and gave him a searching look. What happened? He handed her the letter. She read it in silence, her expression softening as she reached the end. When she looked up, there was no judgment in her eyes, only an understanding that made it harder to hold his composure. Did you know? He asked quietly. Did you ever hear from her? Monica shook her head. Not me, but before I took over your schedule, Delaney handled your calls. She filtered everything. Delaney, his former assistant, the one he'd instructed to keep his personal life out of the office. He remembered the week after the divorce papers were signed, how he'd told Delaney he didn't want any more calls from Olivia, how he'd insisted he needed focus, not distraction. Get Delaney on the phone, he said, his voice like gravel. Monica hesitated. It's been 6 years, Gabe. She doesn't work for you anymore. I don't care. Find her. Monica nodded and stepped out to make the call. While she was gone, he paced the length of the office, rage simmering beneath his skin. rage at himself, at Delaney, at the choices he'd made to bury everything real under layers of ambition. He heard Olivia's voice in his memory. One day you'll understand that nothing you build will be enough if you're alone inside it. He hadn't understood then. He did now. The phone on his desk rang. He snatched it up before the first chime finished. Monica's voice was careful. "I have Delaney on the line." "Put her through." There was a click, then a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Mr. Hayes? This is Gabe." He gripped the edge of the desk. "I need to know if you ever took messages from Olivia Mercer after she left." Silence stretched so long he thought the call had dropped. Then Delaney exhaled shakily. "Yes, sir. She called. Many times. And you didn't think to tell me?" "You." Her voice broke. "You told me you didn't want to be disturbed. You said if she tried to contact you, I was to return everything unopened, that you needed a clean break." His heart thudded once painfully. He remembered saying those words. But he hadn't imagined she'd take them so literally, or that Olivia would stop trying. "How many messages?" he demanded. "A dozen, maybe more. Letters, too." "And you never thought?" "I was doing what you asked," Delaney whispered. "I thought it was what you wanted." He didn't trust himself to answer. He hung up without another word and pressed the phone to his forehead, breathing hard. He had told himself he was protecting himself from pain. All he'd really done was guarantee he would be haunted by regret. Monica re-entered quietly. "Gabe, I have to see her," he said, cutting her off. "Today. She might not be ready. She doesn't have to be, but I'm not hiding behind lawyers or assistants anymore." He went to the coat rack, pulling on his jacket with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Monica watched him with an expression he couldn't name, part sadness, part approval. When he passed her on the way to the door, she laid a hand on his arm. "For what it's worth," she murmured, "it's never too late to try." He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Outside, the morning traffic crawled along Fifth Avenue, horns blaring. He barely noticed. All he could see was the memory of three small faces, laughing in a restaurant he'd thought was his domain. The irony wasn't lost on him. All this time, he'd believed he was untouchable, that his walls were strong enough to keep out everything he didn't want to feel. But in the end, love had found a way through the cracks. At Mercer and Associates, he signed in at the front desk, ignoring the curious glances. The receptionist, a young woman with a warm smile, asked if he had an appointment. "No," he said simply, "but I'm hoping Miss Mercer will see me." She disappeared down the hall, and Gabe waited with his heart hammering. After what felt like an eternity, the receptionist returned. "She'll see you, this way." He followed her to a corner office with tall windows and shelves lined with legal texts. Olivia stood behind her desk, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she gestured to the chair across from her. "You came," she said, her voice low. "I had to." He sat, feeling uncharacteristically unmoored. "I read your letter." Her gaze flicked to his, searching. And I don't have excuses, only apologies." She folded her hands on the desk. "That's not why I wrote." "I know." He swallowed. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to understand. All these years you tried to tell me." Her composure faltered just a fraction. "I did, for months. But you were unreachable. And eventually, I had to accept that for both our sakes." He pressed a hand to his chest as if he could steady the ache there. "What happens now?" Olivia exhaled, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "That depends on you. If you want to be part of their lives, it can't be halfway. It can't be on your terms alone." "I don't want it to be," he said softly. "I want to know them, all of them." A long silence followed, filled only by the distant hum of the city. At last she nodded, and something in his chest cracked open, letting in a glimmer of hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. Gabriel didn't expect Olivia to make it easy. As he sat across from her in the tidy corner office, sunlight spilling through the blinds, he could see the fine tension in her posture, the way she kept her hands folded neatly as if to keep them from shaking. For a long time, neither of them spoke. He wanted to fill the silence, to promise her things he wasn't sure he could deliver. But he could see that if he started spinning words like silk, she'd shut the door forever. So he let the quiet stretch until she looked up at him. Her expression measured. "I need you to understand something," Olivia began, her voice low but steady. "I won't let them get hurt. If you're here to soothe your guilt for a few weeks, and then disappear again. I'd rather you walk out now, he swallowed. I'm not here to soothe anything. I'm here because I finally understand what I lost. She studied him, searching for some sign of evasion, some hidden angle. When she didn't find one, she exhaled a breath that seemed to have been lodged in her chest for years. They don't know who you are, she said. Not yet. To them, you're just a man they saw in a restaurant, a man who looked surprised to see them. I was, Gabe admitted. I thought I had made peace with the past, that I could live with the choices I made. But the second I saw them, I knew I was wrong. Olivia's eyes softened, but only a fraction. Ava is the cautious one, she said quietly. She watches everything before she decides what to think. Hila will ask you 100 questions in the first 5 minutes. And Noah. Her voice faltered, a rare crack in her composure. Noah has your eyes. He felt something slip in his chest, the tight knot of grief and longing loosening just enough to hurt in a new way. What do you want me to do? Her fingers tapped once against the desk before she stilled them. If you're serious about this, you'll start by showing up. Not just once, not just when it's convenient. You'll be consistent. You'll be patient. You'll understand that trust isn't something you can buy. I don't want to buy anything, he said, his voice hoarse. I just want a chance. She hesitated, as though fighting some private battle. Finally, she pulled a small folder from the drawer and laid it on the desk between them. His name was written across the tab in her clean, steady handwriting. What is this? He asked, his pulse quickening. Information, she said simply. School schedules, medical records, the things any parent should know. His hand hovered over the folder, unsure whether he deserved to touch it. Olivia must have seen the doubt in his face because she spoke more gently. If you want to be in their lives, Gabe, this is where it starts. He picked up the folder as though it were made of fragile glass. Inside, he found copies of immunization records, school permission slips, and notes in Olivia's handwriting about each child's preferences. Ava liked puzzles. Isla loved astronomy. Noah was terrified of thunder. Each fact was a small window into 6 years he'd missed. When he finally lifted his gaze, Olivia was watching him, her own expression softer, though her voice remained steady. They don't need grand gestures, she said. They don't need a billionaire father who showers them with gifts. They need a man who shows up, one who listens, one who stays. He nodded, unable to speak. As he rose to leave, he hesitated by the door. Will you tell them about me? Her answer came without hesitation. When the time is right. He accepted that. For the first time in his life, he understood that he didn't get to dictate the terms. As he walked down the hallway, he felt the weight of the folder like a promise in his hands. That evening, he didn't go back to the penthouse. Instead, he drove aimlessly through neighborhoods he hadn't set foot in for years. Rows of brick townhouses, small playgrounds crowded with children in bright jackets, parents standing at the fence calling them home for dinner. He found himself imagining what it would be like to stand among them, to wave to a little boy with his eyes and hear him call out "Dad" without hesitation or fear. He parked near a quiet park and sat in the car, the folder open on the passenger seat. One page caught his eye, a note in Olivia's looping script. Noah has mild asthma. Inhaler in the front pocket of his backpack. 6 words. 6 years of her carrying everything alone while he'd buried himself in contracts and board meetings. He thought of Olivia, sitting up with a sick child at 3 a.m, of her holding an inhaler to their son's lips while he signed another deal in Singapore or Berlin or Dubai. The shame was a lead weight pressing into his ribs. When he finally went home, it was nearly midnight. Monica was waiting in the lobby, her eyes flicking to the folder in his hand before she spoke. How did it go? She asked softly. I have a lot to learn, he said, and a lot to make up for. She nodded, her expression as close to maternal as he'd ever seen it. You'll figure it out. I'm not sure I deserve to. Maybe not, she said. But they deserve a father who tries. He carried the folder upstairs and spread the contents across his dining table. As he read, he made notes, appointments, allergies, teacher names. He realized with a jolt that this was the first time in years he'd read something that wasn't about profit margins or quarterly forecasts, and for the first time in years, he felt awake. The next morning, he called Olivia. Is there anything they need? He asked when she picked up. There was a pause before she answered. Ava's classroom doesn't have enough books for their reading level. Isla's been asking for a telescope. Noah wants to join the soccer team, but I haven't had time to sign him up. He wrote each item down carefully, though he knew he could have paid for it all 1,000 times over without blinking. That wasn't the point. He wanted to remember, to participate, not just to throw money over a wall and call it love. I'd like to help, he said, but only if it's all right with you. She sounded wary. Help how? I'll cover the books for Ava's class anonymously, the telescope too. And if you'll send me the soccer team information, I'll register Noah myself. She was silent for so long he wondered if she'd hung up. Then she spoke, her voice low. All right, but no grandstanding, Gabe. No cameras, no announcements. I understand. And no expectations that this means anything more than what it is. Of course, he said quietly. Thank you for letting me do this. A few days later, he got a text with a photo. 3 children stood in front of a cardboard box filled with new books. Ava was smiling shyly, Isla was beaming, and Noah looked as though he might burst with excitement. No caption. None was needed. He saved the picture to his phone and stared at it until the screen dimmed. A week later, he learned from Olivia that Noah's soccer team had their first game. He didn't ask if he could attend. He wasn't sure he'd earned that right. But that Saturday, he found himself driving to the field anyway, parking far enough away that no one would see him. He stood behind a low fence, heart hammering, and watched as Noah, his son, ran onto the grass in a too large jersey, dark hair falling over his eyes. When he scored a goal, Gabe felt an unexpected rush of tears. Pride, fierce and aching like nothing he'd ever felt in a boardroom. As the game ended, he turned to leave before Olivia or the children spotted him, but he paused when he heard a familiar voice behind him. You didn't have to stay out here. He turned. Olivia stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. I didn't want to intrude, he said. Being here isn't intruding, she replied after a moment. Not if you're going to be part of this. He swallowed. I don't know how to do any of this. Neither did I, she said quietly. We learn. He nodded, feeling the first true sense of hope since the night he'd seen them in the restaurant. As he watched Noah chase his teammates across the field, he let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe he could still become the father he should have been all along. Gabriel knew that if he wanted to be any kind of father, he'd have to face the rest of his past head-on. And that meant confronting the people who had taught him to believe that love was a transaction, something measured in appearances and control. He tried to prepare himself as he stepped into the cavernous foyer of the Hayes family estate. The house hadn't changed in 30 years, polished marble floors that made every footstep echo, oil portraits of ancestors he'd never met staring down with glassy, disapproving eyes. As a boy, he'd hated the place, but he'd never dared to say it out loud. His father's expectations and his mother's icy standards had left no room for rebellion, no space for the kind of softness he now realized he'd craved all along. He found his parents in the sitting room, seated in matching high-backed chairs that looked more like thrones than furniture. Jonathan Hayes glanced up from the newspaper, his mouth tightening when he saw his son. Gabriel, this is unexpected. His mother, Helen, didn't look up from her tablet. We heard about your little incident at the Waldorf. I assume you've come to explain yourself. I don't owe you an explanation, Gabe said, though his voice was quieter than he meant it to be. Old habits, old fears. But you deserve to know the truth. Helen lifted her gaze at last, sharp blue eyes so much like his own. Truth? Really, Gabriel, you sound sentimental. Olivia had children, my children, 6 years ago. Jonathan's brows drew together. Children, plural? Triplets, Gabe said evenly, though his pulse raced. Their names are Ava, Isla, and Noah. Silence bloomed in the elegant room, thick and cold. His mother's expression didn't change, but a muscle in her jaw ticked. And you're certain they're yours? He felt something in him snap, a thin filament of patience finally breaking. Yes, he said. I saw them. You would know it yourself if you looked into Noah's eyes. His father cleared his throat, folding the paper with deliberate precision. Have you considered what this will mean for the company? Or our reputation? Gabe laughed then, a short, incredulous sound. Our reputation? That's what you're worried about? Not the fact that I've missed 6 years of their lives because I was too much my father's son to go after what mattered? Helen's nostrils flared. Watch your tone. No, he said, his voice steadying as the words gathered force. I've spent my whole life watching my tone, doing exactly what you both expected. And look where it got me. A life so empty I didn't even recognize what love looked like when I saw it. His mother's fingers flexed around the edge of her tablet. What do you intend to do now? Parade them around for sympathy? Let that woman extort you? You don't know Olivia, he said. She hasn't asked for a cent. All she's ever wanted is to protect them. Something you might understand if you'd ever tried to protect me. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, but Helen's face remained a perfect mask. You're making a mistake. No, he said quietly. The mistake was thinking you were right about what mattered. He turned to leave, and as he reached the doorway, his father called after him. Gabriel. He paused, hand on the doorframe. Jonathan's voice was softer when he spoke again. If you walk away from the company now, you can't expect to come back. For a moment, that old dread rose in him, the fear of exile, of losing the one thing he'd been told would prove his worth. But then he pictured Ava's careful smile, Isla's eager questions, Noah's bright, wondering eyes. He thought of Olivia, standing in that park, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. And he knew the choice was already made. I'm not walking away, he said. I'm reprioritizing. If that costs me my seat at the table, so be it. Helen made a small, disgusted sound, but Jonathan only nodded, as though he'd expected nothing less. Without another word, Gabe stepped into the hall and shut the door behind him. His heart was racing, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like panic. It felt like freedom. Outside, the sky was a clear, impossible blue. He stood on the wide stone steps, breathing it in, and wondered why it had taken him so long to understand that the world wouldn't end if he disappointed them. That sometimes the greatest act of love was refusing to repeat the mistakes you'd been taught. Later that afternoon, he met Olivia at a quiet cafe near her office. She was already seated when he arrived, her hair pulled back in a low knot, a pale blue blouse softening the severity of her usual work clothes. He paused in the doorway, taking in the way she watched the door as if she'd been waiting for him longer than she'd admit. He slipped into the chair opposite her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. How did it go? She asked finally. I told them, he said. They were exactly as you'd expect. Her mouth curved faintly. I'm sorry. I'm not. He surprised himself with the truth of it. It was overdue. She looked down at her hands as though steeling herself. Gabe? There's something we need to discuss. He nodded, bracing for whatever she'd say. All right. The kids are starting to ask more questions, she said. About you, about why you were at the soccer game. Isla said you look familiar, like someone from a story. His throat tightened. And what did you tell them? That you're someone important to me. That I wanted to make sure they had a chance to know you, if that was what they wanted too. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat. Thank you. They'll have more questions, Olivia went on. We have to decide how to answer them. I don't want to confuse them, he said. I don't want to make promises I can't keep. Then keep them, she said simply. He met her eyes, startled by the quiet conviction there. For all the hurt and distance between them, she had never stopped being the person who challenged him to be more than he thought he could. I'm trying, he whispered. I know, she said, her voice softer now. And I think they're ready to meet you properly. His heart gave a hard, painful thump. Really? She nodded, a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. If you are. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering the courage that still felt too new, too fragile. But when he opened them again, he found he meant it. I am. They made a plan, something small, something safe. A Saturday morning at the children's favorite park. No expectations, no declarations. Just a chance to stand in front of them and say at last who he really was. That evening, he sat at his kitchen counter with the folder Olivia had given him spread out before him. He read every page again, memorizing the details he'd missed. Ava's favorite book series. Isla's obsession with planets. Noah's quiet fear of thunderstorms. He wrote their names over and over in a notebook, as if practice could make them feel real. At midnight, he called Monica. Clear my calendar for the next month, he said. Everything that isn't essential. She didn't ask why. She only said, of course. in that calm way of hers. When he hung up, he felt the strangest thing, a flicker of excitement, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was young enough to believe the world was full of possibilities. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, that Olivia was right. Showing up once wouldn't be enough. He would have to prove himself every day in small, unglamorous ways. He would have to learn how to be the kind of man who stayed. He looked around the penthouse, the polished floors, the art on the walls, the view he used to think meant he'd made it. For the first time, it all looked absurd. He didn't want to measure his worth in how high he could climb, but in how deeply he could love. When dawn came, he was still at the counter, the folder open before him, the names of his children written in his own hand. He traced them with his finger, willing himself to remember what Olivia had said. Keep them. That was all. Show up. Try again. It wasn't too late, not if he made this moment the line in the sand. And he would. He had to, because he had finally learned what mattered. And he would never forget it again. Saturday morning dawned overcast and cool. The sky hung with low clouds that threatened rain. Gabriel stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his razor balanced in his hand, and studied his reflection as if it belonged to a stranger. No matter how many times he rehearsed what he'd say, the words kept dissolving under the weight of possibility. He wondered if Noah would recognize him from the soccer field, or if Isla would ask 100 questions he wouldn't know how to answer. He wondered most of all if Ava would look away, too cautious to let herself hope. In the kitchen, he packed a bag with bottles of water, tissues, and a small tin of mints he'd bought because Olivia had once said he chewed them compulsively when he was nervous. He was nervous now in a way no corporate negotiation had ever made him. At precisely 9, he locked up the penthouse and took the elevator down to the waiting car. The ride to the park was silent, except for the staccato beat of his heart. He kept one hand curled around the strap of the leather bag, grounding himself in the mundane feel of it. When the car stopped at the curb, he didn't get out right away. He sat there, staring through the windshield at the rows of trees lining the walking path, all their new green leaves trembling in the breeze. A little girl in pink sneakers ran past holding her father's hand. The man swung her into the air as she shrieked with laughter, and Gabe felt a strange ache in his throat. He forced himself out of the car before he could talk himself into retreat. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he crossed to the playground where they'd agreed to meet. Olivia was already there, seated on a bench with the children gathered around her. They all wore bright jackets, Ava in purple, Isla in yellow, and Noah in green, and were bent over something in Olivia's lap. He stood a moment behind the wide trunk of an oak, gathering his nerve. Then he stepped into view. Olivia looked up first. Her expression was hard to read, steady, resolved, but something gentler flickered behind her eyes. She raised a hand in greeting. Slowly she turned to the children. "Kids," she called, her voice carrying over the chatter of the other families. "Can you come here for a second?" Ava looked up with her solemn eyes. Isla bounced to her feet with quick, curious energy. Noah held back a little, pressing closer to his mother's side as if unsure what was happening. When they reached her, Olivia stood and turned to face Gabe fully. The moment seemed to stretch, the air around them thick and expectant. "This is Gabriel," she said, her voice very calm. "He's someone important, someone I wanted you to meet." Noah blinked up at him, wide-eyed. Ela tilted her head, studying his face. Ava looked away at first, but then she drew in a careful breath and met his gaze with something like quiet challenge. He knelt so he wouldn't be towering over them, the gravel digging into his knees. His heart thumped so hard he thought they must all hear it. "Hi," he said, his voice rough. "I'm Gabe." Noah's brow furrowed. "You were at my soccer game." "I was," Gabe admitted. "I wanted to see you play. You're really good." Isla piped up. "Why were you there? Do you know Mommy from before?" "Yes," he said, feeling his throat tighten. "I knew your mom a long time ago." Ava's voice was the quietest but the most certain. "Are you my dad?" His breath caught. He glanced at Olivia. She gave the smallest nod, permission, an offering of trust he didn't take lightly. He turned back to Ava and felt something in him come unmoored. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm your dad." The world seemed to contract to the space between him and the three small faces watching him. Isla's mouth opened in a soft O. Noah shifted uncertainly. Ava's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "Where were you?" Noah asked, his voice small but steady. "Why weren't you here?" The question hit harder than any accusation could have. He took a breath, knowing this was the first test of many. "I made mistakes," he said honestly. "Big ones. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. And because of that, I missed so much. I'm so sorry." Isla stepped closer, inspecting his face with open curiosity. "Mom said you might come? She said maybe you'd stay." His chest tightened. "I'd like to, if you'll let me." Ava wiped at her eyes and looked at him again, her gaze steady and searching. "Are you going to leave again?" He reached out slowly, offering his hand but not taking hers. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "I won't leave again." For a long moment none of them moved. Then Ela reached out and slipped her small fingers into his. Noah hesitated, then did the same. Ava looked at Olivia, who nodded. With a trembling sigh, she stepped forward and took his other hand. He didn't realize he was crying until Olivia crouched beside them and pressed a tissue into his palm. "Easy," she murmured. "It's all right." The children began to pepper him with questions after that. What did he do for work? Did he have any pets? What was his favorite color? And he answered each one as best he could. Noah was fascinated by the idea that Gabe used to play soccer as a boy. Isla wanted to know if he liked science. Ava didn't say much, but she didn't let go of his hand. They spent the morning exploring the playground. He pushed Isla on the swings until she squealed with laughter. He stood behind Noah as he climbed the ladder to the slide, ready to catch him if he slipped. He sat beside Ava on a low bench as she traced shapes in the gravel with her sneaker. Every now and then, he'd glance at Olivia, who stood apart but watched with a quiet protectiveness. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Around noon, Olivia called them back to the bench. "Time to get your coats," she said. "We'll have lunch and then head home." Noah's face fell. "Can he come too?" The question hung in the air, fragile as spun sugar. Gabe held his breath. Olivia hesitated, then looked at him. "If you'd like to join us, you can." He exhaled. "I'd love that." They walked together to a small cafe a block away, the kids orbiting around them in bright clusters. Gabe held the door as Olivia shepherded them inside. At a corner table, he sat across from the children while Olivia ordered sandwiches and juice boxes. It felt surreal, this small, ordinary moment, more precious than any gala or corporate celebration. When the sandwiches arrived, he helped Isla open her juice, cut Noah's crusts, and handed Ava a napkin when she spilled a little milk. "Do you have a house?" Isla asked between bites. "Yes," he said carefully, "but it's not really set up for kids." "Could we see it someday?" Noah asked. He looked at Olivia, who searched his face for a long beat. Finally, she nodded. "One day," she said. After lunch, they walked back to the parking lot. The children were quieter, the morning's excitement giving way to drowsy calm. Ava held her mother's hand, but every few steps she looked back to be sure Gabe was still there. At Olivia's car, Noah turned and wrapped his arms around Gabe's waist. Startled, he dropped to one knee and hugged his son back, feeling the fierce, protective heat of love he hadn't known he was capable of. "Bye," Noah said softly. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for letting me," Gabe whispered. Isla hugged him next, her arms a quick squeeze around his neck. Ava was last. She didn't say anything, but when she pressed her small hand to his cheek, he thought his heart might shatter from the tenderness of it. When they were gone, he stood in the empty lot, the gravel bright with afternoon sun, and felt an unfamiliar sense of purpose settle over him. He had no illusions about the work ahead. He knew he couldn't erase the years he'd missed or expect forgiveness to be instant, but he could be here. He could keep showing up, day after day, until his children knew, without question, that he wasn't going anywhere. He pulled out his phone and texted Olivia. "Thank you for today, for trusting me enough to begin." Her reply came a minute later. "Thank you for showing up. That's all that matters right now." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, took a steadying breath, and walked to his car. As he drove home, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for in a long time. The quiet, growing certainty that this was just the beginning. Gabriel didn't sleep much the night after meeting his children properly. Even when he lay down, exhaustion tugging at him like an anchor, his mind kept replaying the feel of small hands in his, the bright curiosity in Ila's voice, the unguarded moment when Noah had hugged him. And Ava, so solemn and watchful, her eyes had stayed with him most of all. The knowledge that she might take the longest to trust him settled heavily on his chest, a responsibility he felt in his bones. By dawn, he'd already made coffee and was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out in a quilt of silver and blue. For years, he'd thought this view was proof that he'd made it, that all the sacrifice had been worth it. Now it just looked like a cage built out of glass and pride. His phone buzzed on the counter. He reached for it automatically, expecting another email from the board demanding an update on the product launch he'd postponed. Instead, he saw Olivia's name. "I wanted you to know the kids woke up this morning talking about you." He read the message 3 times, a slow warmth unfurling in his chest. He was still smiling when he typed back, "Thank you for telling me. I'll do everything I can to deserve that." A moment later, her reply arrived. "Just keep showing up, Gabe. That's all they need." He closed his eyes, letting the words anchor him. He knew there were parts of this journey he couldn't rush. But he could be present. He could be patient. Later that morning, he called his real estate agent, a precise woman named Carmen who had helped him buy the penthouse years ago. "I need to find a new place," he said before she could launch into her usual greeting. "Something more family-friendly." "Family-friendly," she repeated, her voice surprised but curious. "May I ask?" "3 kids," he said quietly. "A backyard, good schools nearby. It needs to feel like a home, not a monument." There was a pause, then the sound of shuffling papers. "I think I know exactly what you're looking for." They spent an hour discussing listings, square footage, school districts, and playground proximity. When he hung up, he felt lighter, as if the simple act of planning a place for his children had shifted something fundamental inside him. That afternoon, Olivia called. Her voice was tired but kind. "Ava has a piano recital next week," she said. "I didn't want you to feel obligated, but she asked if you might come." His heart leapt into his throat. "Of course I'll come." "She gets nervous with big crowds," Olivia added. "If you're there, just be gentle. She won't say much, but she'll know." "I promise," he said, wishing he could reach through the line and reassure her in person. "And Gabe?" "Yes? You don't have to bring anything, just yourself." For a man who had once measured worth in gifts and gestures, it was both humbling and liberating. "I understand." The next few days unfolded in small, hopeful steps. He arranged for a delivery of new art supplies to Isla's classroom, anonymously, just as he had promised. He signed Noah up for soccer camp over the summer, including a note offering to volunteer if they needed extra help. Every evening, he studied the folder Olivia had given him, memorizing details he hadn't known 6 months ago. Which books they loved, which songs made them laugh, which meals made them wrinkle their noses. On Thursday, he met Olivia for coffee to discuss the recital. She was already waiting at their usual corner table, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You look tired," he said gently. 3 kids, a full-time job, and now this," she said with a wry smile. "I think tired is my permanent state." He studied her, struck by the quiet strength she radiated. "I don't think I ever thanked you," he said after a moment. "For what?" "For everything you did alone, for giving them such a good life." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. "It wasn't perfect." "No," he agreed, "but it was good, and I'm grateful." She looked down at her coffee, the steam rising between them. "You know, when I left, I really believed you'd come after me, even once, just to ask why." His chest ached. "I thought you were better off without me." "You thought you were better off without us," she corrected, not unkindly. "And maybe you were, for a while." He didn't argue. She deserved the truth more than his defensiveness. "I was wrong." "Yes," she said simply. "But you're here now." They talked logistics, what time to arrive, where to sit, how to keep Ava from feeling overwhelmed. He took notes on everything, determined not to fail this first real test. On the evening of the recital, he arrived at the school auditorium 20 minutes early. The space buzzed with parents arranging flowers, children fidgeting in shiny shoes. He found his seat near the aisle, hands resting on his knees. When Olivia walked in with the kids, his heart nearly stopped. Ava wore a navy dress with a small white collar, her hair pinned back in a single barrette. She looked so much like Olivia that it startled him. He rose automatically. Olivia gave him a small nod and guided Ava over. You look beautiful, he said softly. Ava studied her shoes, then lifted her gaze, her expression shy but proud. Thank you. He didn't touch her, sensing she needed space. But when the teacher called her name and she stepped onto the stage, she glanced over her shoulder. Their eyes met. He pressed his hand to his heart. She gave a tiny nod as if to say she understood. She played perfectly, clear, delicate notes that filled the auditorium. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until the last chord faded. When the applause started, he clapped harder than anyone. Afterward, in the crowded hallway, she came up to him. Her small hand slipped into his. I was scared, she whispered. I know, he said, voice thick. But you were so brave. She didn't answer, just held on tighter. When it was time to say goodbye, he crouched to their level. I'd like to see you again soon, he said. All of you. Noah grinned. Can you come to soccer practice? Yes, he promised. Isla bounced on her toes. And help me build my science fair volcano? I'd love to. Ava didn't say anything, but when Olivia turned to lead them away, she turned back and hugged him around the neck, quick and fierce. Driving home, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't conquest. It was something better. The slow, careful mending of what had once been broken. The next morning, he called Carmen again. Find the house, he told her. Make it feel like a place where kids can grow. Then he called Monica. Clear my schedule every Thursday afternoon, he said. Every Thursday? She echoed. Yes, I'll be with my kids. She didn't question it. Understood. That evening, he sat in the penthouse living room with the lights low. In his hands was Ava's program from the recital. Her name was printed in neat black letters. Ava Mercer. He thought of what Olivia had said, about not expecting forgiveness, about just showing up, and he knew she was right. He couldn't erase the past, but he could choose the next step. He reached for his phone and texted her. Thank you again for letting me be there, she replied almost immediately. You don't have to thank me. Just keep coming. I will, he wrote back. And he meant it. With every part of himself that mattered, he meant it. The morning Noah was hospitalized, Gabriel felt the world he'd been so carefully building crack right beneath his feet. It had started as any ordinary Saturday. He was in the kitchen unpacking grocery bags, setting out a new jar of strawberry jam he'd found at the market. Olivia had told him it was Noah's favorite. When his phone rang, he almost didn't answer. He was balancing a carton of eggs, listening absently to the radio, and thinking about the science fair Isla had been talking about all week. But when he saw Olivia's name, he set everything down so fast an egg rolled onto the floor and cracked. Olivia? He said, already straining to hear her over the muffled chaos on the line. Gabe. Her voice was too high, too thin, and there was a keening wail in the background that made the hair on his arm stand up. It's Noah. He's having an attack. His inhaler isn't working. We're in the ambulance. His mind blanked, then snapped into a single, ruthless focus. Where are you? St. Mark's. I'm on my way. He was out the door in under a minute. The elevator was too slow, so he took the stairs, leaping 3 steps at a time. In the garage, he practically threw himself behind the wheel, slamming the gas pedal so hard the tires squealed against the concrete. Traffic blurred past him, lights and horns a meaningless smear. He called Monica while he waited at a red light he had no intention of obeying. Clear my entire schedule, he told her. Tell the board whatever you have to. I won't be available today. Is everything? No, he said. Voice breaking. But it will be. He hung up and ran the red. At the hospital, he barely managed to park before he was out of the car and sprinting for the entrance. The triage nurse behind the desk opened her mouth to stop him, but one look at his face must have told her it was pointless. Where's Noah Mercer? He demanded. 3rd floor, pediatrics. But sir, you need... He was already gone, taking the stairs 2 at a time. When he burst onto the pediatric floor, he saw Olivia first. She was sitting on a plastic chair, her elbows braced on her knees, her face hidden behind trembling hands. Isla and Ava sat on either side of her, Ava silent and pale, Isla clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. Olivia, he said, his voice raw. She looked up, and for a moment her composure slipped. She didn't say anything, just reached out, her fingers curling into the fabric of his jacket as if to anchor herself. He's in there, she whispered. They wouldn't let me go with him. His oxygen was too low. He pressed his palm to her cheek, trying to steady them both. "He's strong," he said. "He's going to be okay." Hila crawled into his lap without warning, her small body shaking with silent sobs. He wrapped his arms around her, resting his cheek against her hair. Ava leaned closer, her eyes enormous. "Is he dying?" she asked in a voice so quiet it made him ache. "No," Gabe said firmly. "He's getting help. He's going to be fine." He wasn't sure if he believed it, but he needed them to. They sat that way for what felt like hours. Nurses moved in and out of the hallway, their shoes squeaking against the linoleum. Every time someone in scrubs appeared, Olivia's head snapped up, her hand tightening around his. When the doctor finally emerged, Gabe felt the blood drain from his face. Family of Noah Mercer? Olivia stood so fast her chair tipped over. Gabe rose beside her, Isla still pressed to his chest, Ava clutching his sleeve. "I'm Dr. Patel," the woman said, her voice gentle but brisk. "Noah is stable now. He had a severe asthma attack, but we've started treatment and his oxygen levels are back where they should be." Olivia made a soft, strangled sound, half relief, half exhausted grief. Gabe closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. "Can we see him?" he asked. "Yes, we'll be moving him to a private room shortly. You can come sit with him." The doctor turned away and Olivia sagged against him. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms. For once, she didn't resist. When they stepped into Noah's room, the sight of the boy nearly undid him. He was so small in the bed, a nasal cannula taped beneath his nose, his hair damp with sweat, but when he stirred and opened his eyes, he focused on them with perfect clarity. "Daddy?" he croaked. Gabe's knees nearly buckled. He stepped to the bedside and took Noah's hand in both of his. "I'm here," he said, voice shaking. "I'm right here, buddy." Noah tried to smile, but his eyelids fluttered. "I was scared." "I know," Gabe whispered. "Me too. But you were so brave." He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Olivia watching him with tears in her eyes. "You should stay," she said quietly. "I'll take the girls home for a few hours." "I can." "No," she interrupted gently. "They're exhausted, and he needs you." Ava and Isla hugged their brother carefully. Ava's voice was steady, though her eyes were bright with worry. "We'll come back later." After they left, the room felt too big and too still. Gabe pulled the visitor's chair close to the bed and settled in, never letting go of Noah's hand. For hours he watched his son breathe, every rise and fall of his chest a fragile miracle. He thought of all the moments he hadn't been there. First words, first steps, the first time Noah had felt that tightness in his chest and cried out for someone to help him. And Gabe, who'd been 1,000 miles away signing contracts, had never known. He bent over the small hand in his and pressed his lips to Noah's knuckles. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." Noah stirred, his lashes fluttering. "It's okay," he murmured, already half asleep. "You're here now." Later that night, when Olivia returned with the girls, Noah was sitting up, propped against a stack of pillows, his color much better. He beamed when he saw them, and Hila ran to the bed, her stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand. Ava hung back near the doorway until Gabe held out his hand. She crossed the room slowly, then laid her palm in his. He squeezed it, silent gratitude catching in his throat. "Can we stay with Noah?" Isla asked. Olivia hesitated, glancing at Gabe. He nodded. "I'll go grab some coffee. Let you all have time together." She looked at him for a long moment before answering, "Thank you." In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, but under the wariness something steadier pulsed, a sense of rightness. This was where he belonged. An hour later, he walked back in to find Hila and Ava curled on a chair together, both asleep. Olivia sat by Noah's side, reading softly from a worn storybook. She glanced up when he entered and closed the cover. "He asked if you'd come back," she said. He took a slow breath. "I never really left." She didn't correct him, and somehow that felt like a beginning. At dawn, as the girls slept and Noah dozed between them, Gabe sat in the corner, watching the 3 small faces that had changed everything. He thought of the board meetings he'd missed, the deals he'd delayed. He thought of the old life he'd been so sure he needed. He pulled out his phone and drafted an email to the board of directors. "Effective immediately, I am stepping back from all day-to-day operations. My focus now is where it should have been all along." He read it twice, then hit send without regret. When Olivia looked up in surprise, he met her gaze without flinching. "I'm done choosing work over them," he said. She nodded, her eyes shining. Good, she said simply. They deserve that. And so did he. 2 weeks after Noah came home from the hospital, Gabriel closed the door to his penthouse behind him and knew he could never live there again. The place felt too quiet, too polished, too far removed from the world he had finally decided to embrace. He walked through each cavernous room one last time, trailing his fingertips across sleek counters and cold marble. For so long, he'd believed these silent spaces meant he'd made it, that the emptiness was proof of discipline and ambition. Now all he could see was how much of himself he'd sealed away behind the glass walls. By the time he reached his office, the sun was just starting to sink below the skyline. He switched on the lamp and looked at the framed awards lining the bookshelves, the neatly organized binders of contracts and shareholder agreements. Once he'd been proud of these things. Now, they looked like artifacts from a life he barely recognized. He pulled open a drawer and took out the folder Olivia had given him that first day, the one filled with the children's medical records and school notes. The edges were worn from how often he'd paged through it. He set it on the desk and rested a hand on top of it, feeling the shape of all the days he'd missed. He didn't linger. Instead, he picked up the box he'd brought, just one, because he didn't need much anymore, and left. Outside, the air smelled like rain and fresh pavement. He exhaled slowly, feeling something in his chest finally loosen. The house he'd chosen was nothing like the penthouse. It sat on a quiet street lined with old oaks, the backyard wide and a little wild, perfect for soccer games and telescope nights. The first time he'd driven by it with Olivia, she'd said softly, "This looks like a place kids could grow up." He'd known right then that it was the only place he could imagine living. He spent the first few days unpacking the essentials and leaving the rest in boxes. The house was still mostly empty, but it already felt more alive than the penthouse ever had. When he stood at the kitchen sink in the morning, he could picture Ava coloring at the table, Isla arranging her science kits, Noah kicking a soccer ball across the yard. The image made him smile every time. One evening, Olivia stopped by with the kids to see the house for the first time. They tumbled out of her car in a blur of voices and questions. "Is this really your house?" Isla asked, her eyes huge as she peered up at the porch. "It is," he said, "but I was hoping it might feel like your house too." Noah ran straight to the backyard, calling over his shoulder, "Can I play out here?" "Of course," Gabe called back, his heart lifting as he watched his son kick an invisible ball across the grass. Ava hovered near the door, her gaze taking in the unfamiliar space. When he crouched beside her, she looked up with a hesitant smile. "Would you like to see your room?" he asked softly. She nodded. He led them upstairs to the bedrooms he'd painted in their favorite colors: lavender for Ava, sky blue for Isla, forest green for Noah. Each room held simple furniture, a small shelf for books and toys, and a framed photo he'd found in Olivia's albums. Their first birthday, all three of them smeared with cake and grinning. "I thought maybe you could help me choose where everything else should go," he said, feeling strangely shy. Isla bounced onto her bed, testing the springs with delighted hops. "Can I have a corner for my experiments?" "Absolutely." Noah peeked into his closet, already imagining where he'd put his soccer trophies. Ava walked slowly around her room, trailing a hand along the windowsill. Finally, she turned to him. "It's nice," she said simply. The words were small, but they filled him up more than any boardroom praise ever had. When they went downstairs again, Olivia was waiting in the kitchen, her expression soft but cautious. "This is a big step," she said. "I know," he said, "but I'm ready." She studied him for a moment. "I believe you." The kids stayed for dinner, pizza on paper plates, because he hadn't unpacked the real dishes yet. Noah insisted they eat on the floor, picnic style, so they could watch the backyard through the glass doors. Afterward, as Olivia gathered their coats, Ava lingered behind. She stood in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot. Can I leave my book here?" she asked, holding out a small, well-loved paperback. His throat tightened. "You can leave anything you want." She nodded and set the book on the entryway table, as if staking a claim. When they drove away, he picked it up and carried it to her room, placing it carefully on the bedside shelf. Then he sat on the edge of her bed, feeling the quiet settle around him. For once, the silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. The first overnight came a week later. He spent the whole day preparing, checking the medicine cabinet for Noah's inhaler, arranging Ava's favorite pencils beside her bed, printing out a set of instructions Olivia had emailed him twice, just in case. When they arrived, Ela ran through the house announcing, "I'm home," like she'd been there all along. Noah made a beeline for the yard again. Ava stood in the foyer, her backpack clasped to her chest. "You don't have to be nervous," he said gently. She glanced up at him. "I'm not," she insisted, but he could see the truth in her eyes. So he held out his hand, palm up, and waited. After a long moment, she put her small hand in his. That night, they built a blanket fort in the living room. Ela arranged the pillows, Noah strung up a string of fairy lights he'd found in a box, and Ava curled up in the corner with her book. Gabe made popcorn and sat in the middle, his arms resting across the backs of the cushions. "Can we sleep here?" Noah asked, already burrowing into a sleeping bag. "If your mom says it's okay," he said, glancing at Olivia's number on his phone, ready to call her if any of them got scared in the night. But when he texted her to ask, she only replied, "Of course. I hope it feels like home." And somehow it did. They stayed up late, the three of them telling him about school, about the science fair Isla was planning, about Ulva's new music piece. Noah fell asleep first, curled against Gabe's side. Isla followed not long after, her head on his shoulder. Ava stayed awake longest, her book forgotten in her lap. When her eyes finally drifted shut, he lay there in the hush, feeling their steady breathing, the heat of their small bodies pressed to him. And for the first time, he thought maybe he was doing something right. The next morning, he woke to the sound of Ava's quiet voice. "Daddy?" He blinked, bleary, to find her sitting cross-legged beside him, her hair falling into her eyes. "Yeah, sweetheart," she hesitated. "Can we do this again?" His chest ached. "Anytime you want." After they left that afternoon, he walked through the house, picking up stray socks and empty juice boxes. Each piece of evidence that they'd been there felt like a gift. He set Ava's forgotten hair tie on her dresser and closed the door softly behind him. Later, he called Olivia. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For trusting me. For giving me this chance." Her voice was gentle. "You've earned it." He knew he still had a long way to go, that there would be hard days, old wounds that needed time to heal. But he also knew he'd never stop trying, because this imperfect, beautiful, messy life was worth every second he'd fought for it. This story teaches us something profoundly important about love, regret, and redemption. Gabriel Hayes spent years believing that success was measured in wealth, titles, and the respect of people who never truly knew him. He sacrificed his marriage and missed the first years of his children's lives because he was convinced that chasing ambition was the only way to prove his worth. But in the end, all the trophies and polished boardrooms couldn't fill the emptiness he carried inside. His journey shows that it's never too late to change. No matter how many mistakes you've made or how much time you've lost, there's always a path back to what really matters, if you're willing to be humble, honest, and consistent. It isn't enough to show up once or to offer apologies without action. Real love means choosing to stay even when it's uncomfortable, to earn trust one day at a time, and to accept that healing is not instant. This story reminds us that success has nothing to do with the size of your house or the number in your bank account. True success is measured in the small moments of connection. A child falling asleep against your shoulder, a shared laugh over dinner, the quiet understanding that you are loved simply because you are there. No matter where you are in your life, remember, it's never too late to start showing up for the people who matter most. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about hope, family, and second chances.